On this episode of the show, I have with me Simon Lamb. He is VP of Engineering at M1, and we're going to be talking about how an engineer can have influence. And we're going to be talking about the gap between an IC and an engineering leader and what happens. How do you get that authority? How do you get that influence if you do not have a people leadership title and you don't always have to write blogs, be on podcasts, produce content to do that? We'll ask Simon his thoughts on that. And also, he mentioned something interesting about looking through the lens of change management as an engineer, and we'll ask him about that as well. Simon, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. Before we dive in, what do you guys do at M1?
Yeah, M1, we are a Chicago-based fintech startup. We do wealth management, direct-to-consumer wealth management solutions, so automated investing, margin loans, things of that nature. But yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what M1 does. We provide wealth building solutions for consumers.
Okay, awesome. All right, so this episode, we're going to obviously chat a little bit about how an engineer can have influence, and I think that was an interesting topic to choose because I feel like a lot of times we talk about engineering leaders and their influence, but we don't talk about how an individual contributor can go about that. And I guess let's start there. I guess you've been an engineering leader for a while. How often do you see an individual contributor that actually has found a way to influence without having, a leadership title?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the topic of influence, I think, is a really interesting one to me, especially because oftentimes when we talk about it in the context of career development, it ends up being that thing that people are told, hey, if you want to move up, that's how you do it. You get more influence. And I think it becomes a little bit more apparent and obvious at the higher levels, but maybe not so much when you're a junior developer or a mid-level developer. How do you have influence? Is that an additional role and responsibility on top of the code that you have to write? I will say, based on the way I've come to learn to view influence, I see it a lot. I see that you can, my opinion and what I've observed is you can build influence at any stage of the career ladder. And I think, I can't, maybe this isn't the case for every single company, but typically when we talk about career progression, it's a function of how much impact you have, right? So as an IC, as a junior engineer to senior engineer, it's pretty clear how to do that. You build your features, you write code, you build systems. But then I think you get to the point where the next level is become a staff engineer or become an engineering manager, a shift to a leadership role. There can be, people can kind of hit a wall and there's a little bit of a chasm between that senior engineering role and that next level, which so much so that I think a lot of companies, they say it's okay to sit at that senior level for as long as you want. Like it can be a terminal role for a lot of people. But I think, again, when people ask, well, how do I get there? How do I bridge the chasm? Oftentimes the hand wavy answer can be, well, you need to have more impact. You need to have influence. You go from having impact by doing your work directly to working through other people. And it can be sometimes be unclear, like how to go about making that transition, to get the role that people want.
Yeah. And I think that's a fair statement. I guess when you look at, obviously as a people leader, it becomes pretty easy that you have authority by the virtue of the title and by you're expected to lead. I think authority and influence are two different things. I think having influence, you don't need a title to necessarily have influence, but I also think it's a skill that a lot of people associate with authority. So maybe you defer, you allow others to have a bigger influence. And also, we've made a lot about being team players, and being a team player, you're also trying not to rock the boat. So I think there's a very, slippery slope of dynamics here where we're told, you got to be a team player. Okay, don't rock the boat. but also, hey, if you want to move up, you have to show value, you have to show influence, and you have to show impact. How do you kind of reconcile? I mean, that's a tough, if you're an individual contributor looking to move up, that's just a tough ask, I feel.
Yeah. That's, I think, there's sometimes a conflation of influence with charisma, with having to be an orator, with having to, conflating the word influence in the workplace with maybe the way we think of it in social media. Is it, I have to go make LinkedIn posts? Do I have to write blogs? Do I have to do all of that on top of what I'm already doing? Do I have to be very, very outspoken and rock the boat, as you mentioned, and go up against a senior engineer and disagree with them publicly? My answer to that is, I think I will never say no. I wouldn't say that you can do those things if you want. Like, you can do those things if they're of interest to you. But the way that I've come to view influence is more like, I think I tie it back to that impact. Like they are related. They're different, but they're related concepts. So it's in the way that you have a sphere of impact, or you have an impact radius per se, but then you also have a sphere of influence. The interesting thing to see is that they're different, but they're very closely related. So, if we peer behind the covers, certainly influence affects how effective you can be at your job, right? Like, it can affect how much impact you have. But I think I would posit that the inverse is true too. Having consistent impact is how you build influence. So it's maybe like silly to say out loud, and maybe it seems like an intuitive thing, but it is a bit of a virtuous cycle, which I think is encouraging, because it means you can build influence at any stage of your career, without having to rock the boat per se, or without having to influence in the way that someone might influence in the way that an influencer might have to behave. And I would say, decoupling the two and not conflating influence for charisma helps create, maybe opens up a world of, there are many, many activities that you can do. There's no one right answer when it comes to building influence. And maybe as an example, let's say you're a junior engineer. My opinion is you can build influence by being curious about everything, by learning the ropes quickly. It's doing your job well, right? Like, being consistent, being reliable. Sometimes there is this feeling that our roles and our job descriptions are static. Like, that's really not the case, right? Like, there's a lot of things in between the gaps that need doing. Sometimes people use the word glue work for it. A junior engineer can take initiative and step up, right? Like, and eventually you become your tech lead's go-to person, right? You become influential through being the consistent person, being the reliable person. And I think that pattern can kind of repeat, right? Like, as a mid-level engineer, the complexity of your projects increases. You do them well, you're known as the reliable person for your team. And then as a senior engineer, that pattern expands out to your stakeholders and the other teams that you work with, right? Like, by embracing collaboration and really becoming that trusted partner, you become influential outside of your team. And then by the time you are up for a promotion, it becomes a much easier conversation that, hey, so-and-so has already been exhibiting a lot of these behaviors and working through people, and not necessarily via giving talks or blog posts.
Do you feel there's when we talk about influence, a lot of times there might be confusion that influence means changing people's minds? Is that potentially something, when we tell people to make an impact, be an influencer, obviously not social media context, but within engineering team, do people maybe look at that and go, well, I need to convince people to agree with me, convince people to do this or that? Is that possible, that we're misrepresenting that in people's minds?
Yeah, maybe not misrepresent, but perhaps, but yeah, like give a lot of weight to that particular facet of the job. Which yeah. I won't say that you won't ever have to do that. Certainly, as like let's just say staff engineer, typically one might be tasked with, hey, owning solving a problem for a platform, like if you've got 10 teams working on it, you're going to be making changes that affect a lot of people. So I think, and I think why, hey, changing the notion of changing someone's mind seems very daunting and maybe not particularly energizing. But what I've observed too is as people get more practiced with wielding their influence, what people typically learn is isn't necessarily about gaining 100% consensus all the time. It's probably not going to be possible if you have a big enough audience or a big enough group of stakeholders. But even just using the influence and taking the initiative to go through the process of, I think that's where the topic of change management kind of came up, where that is one tool that, like, viewing influence through that lens is like one tool to reason about what activities you think you should be doing, right? Like, be it, hey, let's write a proposal and let's get feedback. Not everybody will agree, but we get enough sign off and we will move forward with it. And it's less about having to go out and change every single person's mind, but to your original question, I definitely can see that, where influence can be a charged word, where either the idea of someone with a technical background having to do that might not sound particularly appealing if that's what they view it as.
You're right. I didn't imply the word misrepresent. I think you clarified that well. And it's interesting because when we talk about change management and you're thinking about impact effect, you're thinking about, if I go do this, what will happen? And you mentioned, something as simple as going to learn something so that you have more knowledge than the next person in a particular area that you might raise your hand or you might want to be interested in. I think, unfortunately, because we tie career advancement into sometimes who has that voice, who has that ability to speak, and be heard, that's a clear skill, because I feel sometimes you do have people that could have influence, but they necessarily don't have the understanding of how to use their voice potentially, or they're not aware that they could. I mean, a lot of things here we could, but I do think it does impact career advancement. You mentioned somebody could be stuck in a terminal senior role because they can't exhibit this. I guess for the people that do find themselves a little bit more stuck at a level, and obviously I think you've been a hiring manager, you've been a people manager. When you look at the component of influence, it's hard to obviously understand context of every person and how they relate to using their voice, their quote unquote influence. Can you factor some of that in when you are looking at people in the career ladder? Is it just really too hard for a hiring manager to be that much of us? I guess not psychiatrists, I was psychologist, but you have to know the human mind pretty well to read some of this stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think because what you point out is, do we have systems that optimize for the outspoken person? It's almost like the are we rewarding folks who are more introverted as opposed to people that are valuable or that are impactful, but maybe a little more soft spoken? And I think perhaps it's a cop-out answer to say that it can be boiled down to, sometimes it's art, sometimes it's science. And I think what I've seen as an effective way of mitigating for some of that bias sometimes is to bring it back to impact when it comes to if we're internally calibrating on whether someone is or isn't up for promotion, or I think it's not a perfect science, but I think tying it back to impact is kind of how we avoid making career progression conversations about qualitative things like, oh, they're so outspoken, oh, they are so influential. And I think at the end of the day, I would argue that that's what matters to the business. And I think what's refreshing, or at least like freeing in the way that I felt, or in the way that I propose how one can look at influence, is if we tie it back to impact, that means it's open-ended as far as how you build influence, how you want to wield it, as long as it's you're you're being impactful, and whatever that may mean specifically for your business. And so I think that's kind of how I would respond to that, where I definitely can see the concern where it's if we're conflating the two things, and in the end, is it a charisma, a measure of charisma, and we're progressing people that way, and it's totally acknowledge that people have biases, and sometimes that does come into play. But I would say if someone is my take for someone who feels like they want to move to the next level and maybe feeling stuck is, hey, for the next review, like let's tie the review back to the impact that you had, be it you shipped a number of features, or you improve the platform in some meaningful way, or if your org has some metric that they want you to move. I think those are all ways to get around. I'm soft spoken and I don't like public speaking or.
I actually love that answer because this episode, obviously we're talking about having influence. And as I'm hearing you speak more, I feel sometimes that word is thrown around in conversations. I think people managers probably, lean towards impact. We may not always articulate it because as a people manager, you might think influence and impact are actually very similar. But I think obviously if you're more junior, that will actually mean something different to you. And you just, outlined, obviously impact can be a little bit more, it can be more objective. Influence is very subjective. It's very hard to determine from one to another. If you have advice for junior, engineers, more mid-career engineers that are, very interested in hearing about how to move up and move forward, and they probably are hearing, lots of different things out there as well. If they're looking to actually build impact over influence, which maybe really what we're talking about now is impact, is where do they start? Is it raising their hand? Is it trying to find something a team needs and just going after it, learning more on their own? Where are some areas people can make impact like that?
Yeah, I think it certainly starts with the mental frame, like the mental model of concentric circles. Like I think like a honeycomb chart always helps in my mind, where it's like you've got your core responsibilities and the things that you were hired to do, right? Like your job description. I think first and foremost is just making sure your bases are covered there, right? Like be consistent, do a good job there, and like that's always where. Right, like let's make sure you walk before you run. But I think beyond that, I think my opinion is influence, especially when we conflate it with influencers and some of the more like extroverted and right, public speaking, almost like branding. Like it's more about when we think of it as branding. I think my opinion is more that like influence and impact. I think it's really rooted in trust, and it's kind of like that type of thing is very hard to build with one act of heroic, like just a few acts of heroics. It's about being consistent. It's being about, so, if you raise your hand once, great. But I think if you're able to genuinely, identify where the value is, and it could be as simple as, right, like our team processes, somebody needs to, or it would be beneficial for someone to lead, and I think I would kind of point out that like there are a lot of topics that are related. They're different but related, and like a lot of the examples I've given too about how to have impact and build influence. There are also examples of how to be leaders, right? Like how to be leaders without the title. You see a gap, you try to fill it. Your teammate needs help. You reach out to help, and I think it's the kind of like the compound interest of these behaviors over time that kind of crystallize into. One day you're going to realize that, like, well, actually everybody does rely on me, or everybody trusts me, versus how do I get it overnight, right? I think So I think that's kind of my my non-answer is it's more about just consistently building trust. And of course, like concrete examples are going to be different from team to team. Is it our process needs help, or there's obvious tech debt that I can jump on? Our test can I help with the test coverage? There are, I think the potentially scary but also wonderful thing is that there's not always there are many ways to have impact, and of course you check with your manager or check with the folks to make sure you're rowing in the same direction. But it could even be, hey, take a moment to really understand the business context, right? Or take a moment to really, if you're working with a design team or a compliance team or the business team, like being able to not just say your job ends at I'm writing the code. Like that's another way of having impact and at the same time building influence.
I actually like that a lot because I think you clarified some of this conversation of influence, impact, and obviously how to kind of navigate that. And maybe obviously we can only ask so many questions about this, but maybe one final question that we can talk about is, this is not a skill. I think through school we're taught to do things and to take positions of leadership because of impact, right? I feel like we're taught early on that you gravitate towards impact and it leads towards leadership. Maybe that's a little, it could be false, not always true. But anyways, I think that's a stereotype I'll just hold to for a second. I guess you can also go, you know what, I really love the impact. Don't want to have people leadership, and that's okay too. And obviously there's tracks within engineering you could do that. I guess for a second, maybe to talk to those people that, they're going to see progressive expertise growth. They're going to see further impact because of that knowledge. And it's okay not to go into the actual people leadership side.
I think, is the question whether they do have to go into the people leadership side?
Yeah, I think traditionally society kind of views impact moving into people leadership. I feel like that's just a progression people see, that if you have a lot of impact, you keep moving up, and your final destination is you manage people so you can yield authority and impact. I guess in this case, we're talking about someone that's okay not managing people because they just don't like it, but they want to have that impact.
Yeah. To that, I will say that's a potentially whole another a topic to really dive into too. In that people leadership is sometimes people do expect that, like, hey, I'm a great engineer, I will probably be a good people manager as well. That's a pretty classic trap that folks fall into, where it's actually a pretty different role. But I think that the great thing is that if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. I think a lot of companies have dual tracks now, where you can either be a people manager or you can be a staff engineer, more along that side where you don't have people management duties. But I do think what folks probably will want to know is those are both leadership positions oftentimes. And so one may be leading teams and leading the people side of it. The other may be stewarding a platform, stewarding technology. And the expectation more often than not is that they have comparable amounts and scopes of impact. And I think that's where I do think, managing people is probably certainly not a requirement, but the higher you go working with people, working through people, I think that's probably like a common expectation for either role. So, I think that can sound daunting, that can sound scary, but I would argue that, let's just say as a staff engineer, you can influence isn't a single thing you have. I think it's nice to maybe think of it as like a toolbox. It's a skill, knowing which tool to use in a situation, and examples of tools maybe, hey, look, you see something that looks very much like a change problem, or let's apply change management principles to it, and roll out all the different tactics related to that. Or it can even be having the experience to recognize when something can be done with pure influence alone, or, hey, I actually need to go get sponsorship. I need to go talk to my boss. I need to go get budget for something. And so I think it's maybe this isn't explicitly taught in schools, and you might not be able to take a class on it, but I think people do pick up on, they exercise these types of skills throughout, right? When you're working on a group project, or you're leading your fraternity or leading your club. And I think it's nice that for someone coming into the career, coming into the workforce, to sort of recognize that all of that stuff was valuable. All of that stuff you can kind of bring forward and build out your toolkit as you progress in your career.
I love it. Simon, I think we got through a bunch of questions here, and I'm sure as we switch from influence to impact, we might have spurred a few more. I guess if somebody did want to reach out to you for a follow-up question on this topic, is there a good way of connecting with you?
Yeah, absolutely. My email is s.lamb@m1.com, and would be very happy to field questions or connect with folks who are also passionate and interested in this topic.
Fantastic. Simon, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, two things. One, we started off talking about how an engineer can have influence. Obviously, there's a difference in terms of how that's viewed, and you always don't have to go write blogs or be on podcasts to generate that influence. There's a lot of things that you can do, and you don't always have to have authority to have influence. And then we realized, well, actually, impact might be really what we should be talking about, and less of that influence component. I think Simon covered a lot of ground for us, so please share this episode with somebody else who might really benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.